Hi, I'm Kate. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about the case of Betty Broderick, and recently this case has gotten a bit more attention thanks to a TV series starring Christian Bale and Amanda Peet, but this case has always intrigued people. Despite the fact that Betty, spoiler alert, killed 2 people, a lot of people at the time as well as today sympathize with her. According to her, she was the victim, and even though she didn't really intend to kill them, they still deserved it. So, did they? No. I'm going to go ahead and say that, no. But a lot of people think they did. The story she told was of a hardworking woman who sacrificed and worked multiple jobs so that her husband could go to medical school and law school, and then, when he was successful and didn't need her support anymore, he traded her in for a younger model. For a lot of people at the time, particularly women who may have gone through something similar, her rage was understandable. According to the prosecution, however, even though the other parties in this case made mistakes, Betty was the main cause of her own problems. So, what's the truth? Only Betty is left to tell her story personally, but I'd say the truth is probably somewhere in between. So, let's hear both sides. Most of my research for this video was actually taken from the actual trial footage. This was the second trial because the first trial ended in a mistrial after the jury couldn't come to a decision. And there's quite a lot of this footage. It was the course of multiple days, witnesses, evidence. Betty herself took the stand. It is broken down into somewhat manageable parts. I'll link the main page with all the videos down below if you want to check it out. I'll initially go over the main events, mostly from the point of view of the prosecution, and then go back and cover Betty's side of the argument. So keep in mind a lot of what happened is disputed by either one side or the other, and some of it may be either true or false depending entirely upon the perspective of the people involved, so just keep that in mind. Let's get into it. Betty Broderick was born Elizabeth Ann Biseglia in 1947 to a Roman Catholic family, one of 6 siblings. She was raised in a strict traditional home where she claims her parents basically raised her to be the perfect housewife from an early childhood. She says that she was pressured to marry a Catholic man and have his children and support him unconditionally. The year that she graduated high school, she was going to a football game at Notre Dame University. She didn't go there, and that's where she met Dan Broderick. He also didn't go there, but they were both there for the game. He was also from a large Catholic family, and the two ended up getting married a few years later in April of 1969, and by the time they came home from their honeymoon, Betty was already pregnant with their first daughter, Kim. Over the next 10 years or so, they had at least 9 pregnancies, but had multiple miscarriages and ended up losing one baby shortly after it was born, but they ended up with raising 4 children. After their first daughter's birth, Dan finished his medical degree, so they'd been married about a year at this point, and eventually he decided to go to Harvard Law School as well. And while he was getting his degrees, supposedly Betty was the main provider for the family. She worked multiple part-time jobs. She did daycare during the day sometimes and then worked at night. And she also took care of the children and was a housewife as well. It seemed like all of their hard work was about to pay off, though, when Dan graduated and he quickly got a job at a law firm in California. Family moved there, eventually settling years later in a suburb of San Diego called La Jolla. And Betty continued to work part-time even after Dan got this job as an associate at this law firm. She worked at some multi-level marketing companies, including Tupperware and Avon, and was also a stay-home mother at this time. At a certain point, Dan left his job at his original law firm and decided to go into practice for himself. So he now had his own law firm. He could do what he wanted. He mostly did medical malpractice stuff, which was bringing in a lot of money, and eventually he hired a 22-year-old former flight attendant, Linda Colcana, as his legal assistant. Really, right from the beginning, Betty suspected something was going on between them. Within like a year or so, Dan supposedly told Betty that he wasn't happy in the marriage, and Betty's version of events has him saying very cruel things about her age and appearance, and very brief trigger warning here for self-harm. She did commit some minor self-harm here, and Dan, at that point when he found out, according to Betty, he cried about it and told her nothing was going on with Linda. She didn't have to worry. At one point, for Dan's birthday, Betty dressed up and brought a bunch of stuff over to his office to celebrate and surprise him. And when she got there, she saw that they had apparently already had a little party, and Dan was out for lunch with Linda. And according to Dan, this was fully professional, of course, but Betty went home and took all of Dan's expensive custom-made suits and burned them. Betty claims that Dan continued to deny anything was going on and started gaslighting her, telling her she was crazy and imagining things, and if she thought these things, something was wrong with her. And Betty even suspected that Linda and Dan were intentionally messing with her. Supposedly she got advertisements in the mail for wrinkle treatments and weight loss treatments. Prosecutors actually think she may have sent these to herself. It's not really clear who sent them, but she supposedly did get these, and they were postmarked from another city. And prosecutors later said that the Brodericks' marriage hadn't been picture perfect long before Linda came along. Supposedly years ago, Betty had said to her daughter that she and Dan were getting a divorce and asked who she wanted to live with. If Dan worked late, which he often did, Betty would lock him out and jam his skis against the door so that they'd break if he tried to force the door open. She was also known to throw things across the room and intentionally break things. She was also said to often criticize him in front of other people. Dan moved out of the family home in 1985, eventually confessing that he was having an affair with Linda and had been for years, and a long, contentious divorce proceeding began. By this point, Dan was a pretty successful lawyer. In 1986, he was voted in as president of the San Diego Bar Association. At this point, they were already separated, but it's not surprising that she thought he was able to manipulate things legally to put her at a disadvantage. She claimed that he used his position and influence to make it difficult for her to even get a good lawyer to represent her in the divorce, and that it got him sole custody of the children. She thought that he made it so that she couldn't get her fair share of the income. However, custody actually was given to Dan after, over the course of months, Betty just dropped the kids off at his house. She supposedly told people that if she wasn't going to be his wife, she wasn't going to take care of his kids. And after the split, Betty seemed to become obsessed, telling everyone how badly she'd been treated by Dan. It was really all she could talk about, and she even lost some friends over it. At this point, they were both living in different houses from their original house, although the timeline of that is a little weird to me. But at the very least, Betty was not living in their original house, which was called the Coral Reef House. And she would, even though she wasn't supposed to, she would go in there, she'd break in, she'd spray paint the house, break stuff. She took a pie and mashed it into his clothes and carpet. She would hit his car with rocks and broke off the antenna. She dumped trash in his yard. And eventually Dan got a restraining order against her, which wasn't really surprising. Betty then started leaving harassing messages on his voicemail, and she left a lot of them. The prosecution opening statement of 1991 trial plays several of these voicemail messages, and they are bizarre. She ignored repeated warnings to stop because of the restraining order, and at the end of one call, Betty told her son that she wished his father would die and Linda would get drunk and drive off a cliff. Their daughter Kim testified that her mother had also said that she hated Dan and wished their children had never been born. And they ended up having something called a bifurcated divorce, which essentially they get divorced and are like legally divorced, but they haven't worked out all of the details yet, and they do that afterwards. So they were technically divorced in 1986, but they were still working out all of the custody and the division of assets and all that stuff for years afterwards. A few months after they were formally divorced, Betty went to Dan's house and forced a confrontation with him, supposedly called him a gross creature, and when she refused to leave, he called the police. When the police arrived, she still refused to leave and was arrested. She ended up spending, I think, a few days in jail, eventually was released, but this was, of course, just one more thing Betty said that, Dan had her arrested. At one point, Dan wanted to sell their old house, this coral reef house, and Betty didn't want him to sell it, even when he agreed to give her more than half of the selling price, which she requested, but she then refused to take it. And so he got a court order to sell this house. And this was another thing that Betty brought up a lot, that he had sold this house out from under her without her permission. But she broke into the house and splashed gasoline around and tried to light it on fire, but it wouldn't ignite. So then she drove over to Dan's new home and intentionally rammed her car into the front of the house. Then she supposedly backed it up and hit the car into the house again. And their children were inside the house at this time, but they fortunately were not physically hurt. No one was. But afterwards, the police checked her into a county mental health facility, although Betty claimed that Dan had her committed. He used his influence with the police to have her committed. As a result, the court determined that Dan should have full custody and Betty would have no visitation for the time being. This was meant to be a temporary thing. She was supposed to get checked out by a therapist, but she would just refuse to participate. So at this point, she wasn't supposed to have any visitation, and Betty claimed that Dan was trying to take her kids away from her, but he actually still allowed her, their two sons anyway, to have visits. And prosecutors say that Betty was constantly trying to turn their kids against Dan and Linda. She would cross Dan out of family pictures. She supposedly even drove her youngest son to be so stressed that he cut out chunks of his hair. It was really bad. Also, although Linda claimed that repeatedly that Dan had left her with nothing, he actually bought her an expensive home. She claims that it was in very poor shape and needed a lot of repairs, but it was still an expensive home. The terms of their divorce, at this point it was voluntary, but he was giving her over $1,600 a month in alimony, and eventually she was going to get another $1,500 in child support. She had 2 cars. She was able to spend thousands of dollars on clothes and jewelry. And part of the reason that she may have not had enough money at certain points was because they had this system set up, at least Dan had set it up, that every time that she called and used curse words or threatened them, he would deduct $100 from what he was going to give her that month. And, if she came onto his property, she would deduct, $500. If she tried to see the kids without his permission, that would be like $1,000. And at some point, she even went into the negative with this because she was just harassing them so much. And prosecutors say that Betty's primary motivation, both even in getting married to Dan in the first place and the divorce, was money. There was a consistent thing where she was obsessed with money, and that's all she cared about. But it wasn't just money, but also the status that came from being Mrs. Broderick. And if she couldn't have that, she wanted Dan and Linda to suffer. At the same time, though, she supposedly had started dating another man named Brad Wright in 1985, which was before they were even initially divorced, that initial divorce that happened in 1986. I've also seen him referred to as just a friend, so it's kind of unclear to me, but at the trial in the opening statements, the prosecution did say that he was her boyfriend, and he had actually been sleeping over at her house the night that the eventual murders took place. But we'll get to that later. In January of 1989, the divorce finally fully settled. Although Dan still got custody of their children, Betty was once again given regular visitation. Their oldest daughter was already going off to college, and their second daughter was getting pretty close. But Betty appealed the divorce settlement, this final divorce arrangement. She appealed it. Her motivation, supposedly, according to her, was she wanted full custody of the children, and she didn't want Dan and Linda to have any visitation at all. But for years, she had mentioned killing or wanting to kill Dan and Linda. At least one of the voicemail messages that she left included a statement that basically said she wanted to kill them. But most people, even if they were a little worried by this behavior, didn't really believe she was serious But in March of 1989, Betty bought a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson gun. This was a non-automatic gun, which meant that to fire it, you had to fully pull the trigger each time. She went into Dan and Linda's house. Even again, she was not supposed to do this, but she went into their house and found a list of guests that they were going to invite to their upcoming wedding and took it. Then she mentioned that she might go to the wedding and shoot them both. She went to shooting ranges to practice. And because of this, Dan and Linda actually hired security guards for their wedding. And now Linda was Mrs. Broderick. That summer, Betty spent most of it in Canada with her sons. They were allowed to go with her, and Betty's attorney filed for full custody. Supposedly, according to the prosecution, Dan decided to go ahead and negotiate with her. Allegedly, he didn't want to keep the fighting going. He just wanted it over with. He wanted to move on with his life. And perhaps realizing that Dan and Linda just wanted to move on, and angry that she wouldn't be able to truly, get even with them, Betty went to their home and in the early morning hours of November 5th, shot them both. As she later said, the situation was resolved. So what was Betty's side of the story? What was her explanation of the events that made her the real victim? Betty's defense attorney's argument was basically that Betty was just a hard-working, devoted wife and mother who worked multiple jobs so that her husband could get his degrees. Dan, on the other hand, was allegedly both verbally and physically abusive. He gaslighted Betty for years, denying having an affair before trading her in for a younger model. When they split, he used his power and influence to get the upper hand, trying to destroy Betty's reputation so that if she told the truth about Dan, no one would believe her. She claims that from the very beginning of their marriage, Dan was in complete control of their money, and he was also very controlling of her, told her what she could do, where she could go, everything. She worked up until the day before she gave birth to the first child and went back to work the day after. She sacrificed and worked so Dan could go to law school. She worked multiple jobs, including at night. She claims that Dan was the one who was obsessed with money, liking to spend it on expensive clothes and food, while the rest of the family often went without. There was no way that Dan could have gotten through law school without her working multiple jobs, and that even after he got his first job as a lawyer, she still needed to keep working. She was a housewife, not a greedy socialite like she'd been painted. Her family was all she wanted and needed. She says that any pre-existing issues in their marriage were because Dan wasn't home enough, that he would go out drinking with his friends from work until late at night while she was alone with the children, that he was a workaholic, thinking only of his own success and what that success could buy him. She claims that Dan was domineering, that he even hit her, that he would throw and smash things behind closed doors when he was angry. After they split, she says she got messages from her kids crying and asking for her. It was only after getting these messages and trying to call back multiple times without an answer, supposedly they turned the ringer off. This was only after that she left the angry voicemails, and she says that Dan and Linda would edit the tapes so that only Betty's angry messages would be there. She also says she was set off by the fact that Linda's voice was on the answering machine even before she moved into the house. So when she called, Linda's voice would answer and say, "You've called the Brodericks," even though at that point she wasn't a Broderick. Linda would also allegedly tell the kids that Betty was crazy. She said that she would leave post-it notes on court documents that were sent to Betty, that copy of the documents was for the fat one, that she and Dan would intentionally rile her up so that they could then use that as evidence against her. Betty also claims that 2 DUIs that Dan had were left out of the court records, and that judges and the court gave Dan preferential treatment. She says that she tried multiple times to settle the divorce, but Dan refused. Supposedly he was using this legal rule where if he paid off certain bills and debts while they were still technically married, he could then deduct that from the amount that he had to give her in the settlement. So he was supposedly doing that and intentionally drawing out the proceedings so that he wouldn't have to give her very much. She says that while Dan was wearing designer suits, there was often not any food for the children. There was just like steak in the fridge, and that the children occasionally went to school with holes in their clothing and shoes, that they were sick and she wasn't informed. She also claimed that even after their separation, she was still paying off his student loans from law school. She says that Dan and Linda would keep changing the days that she would have the children. They do this at the very last minute, so she couldn't make any plans. And she eventually then came to the conclusion that they were never going to let her get custody of her children again. She claims that she went to Dan and Linda's house on the morning of November 5th just to talk to and confront Dan because she thought she had no chance in the courts. She says she brought the gun with her because she felt threatened. She also says that she just took it everywhere with her at that point. But if he refused to listen to her, she was planning on using the gun on herself. When she went up to the room, Linda supposedly yelled out, "Call the police," and as a reflex, she fired the gun until it was empty. She said afterwards that she didn't even know if she hit anyone. After she left the house, she called her daughter from a phone booth and then went over to her daughter's house to talk about surrendering. She also called some of her other friends, told them the same thing. She didn't try to pretend that she hadn't shot someone. However, Betty gave slightly differing accounts of that morning. She claims initially she was just leaving the house to take a walk on the beach. This was, again, very early in the morning. It was still dark, before dawn, and she brought the keys to her ex-husband's house as well as her gun. It was before she got to the beach. She was on her way, supposedly. She decided to go over Dan and Linda's house to confront them, and if they refused to talk to her, she was going to shoot herself. At the trial, she says she doesn't even really remember what happened in the bedroom, but she also said at other points that she remembers
in fact, you made a specific correction with Amy Wallace about what Dan Broderick had said after you shot him.
After she shot him.
You indicated that Lee, who had testified that he said, okay, you shot me, I'm dead. You called up Amy Wallace and you told her, no, that's not right. That's not what he said. He said, okay, you got me, I'm dead, correct?
Right.
Didn't you just testify before lunch that you didn't remember him saying anything to that effect?
I didn't remember him sitting up in bed and saying anything like that, no.
She says that the gun went off as a reflex, like she clutched it as a reflex when Linda yelled out, "Call the police." However, the prosecution pointed out that if it really was just a reflex reaction, she likely would have shot the floor because she was holding the gun down at her side in her hand. So she would have had to lift the gun up in order to shoot them, and the reflex would have had to happen 5 times with her changing her aim. During the opening statements of the trial, the prosecution emphasized all of the choices Betty had to make before killing Dan and Linda. She got into the house with a set of keys she had taken from her daughter earlier. She brought her handgun. She drove over to the house, which was located about 15 minutes away. She parked outside the house and got out of the car. Then she walked around the house to enter in through the back door, where she would be less likely to be heard. Then she went through the house and upstairs to her ex-husband's bedroom, where she entered through a side door, not the more easily accessible hall door. She then stood next to their bed while they slept and shot at them 5 times, emptying her gun. Then, as a wounded Dan reached for the phone, she walked around the bed, took the phone, and ripped it from the wall, eventually leaving it in the hall outside the room. Even if Betty could try and explain away some of those choices, her supposed motivation for entering the house that night does not match up with those choices. The second jury came close to another stalemate as the first jury had, but they eventually came to the conclusion that Betty was guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She's been up for parole a couple of times since then, but was denied each time, at least in part because she continues to show no remorse or admit any wrongdoing. At her parole hearing in 2010, a couple of her children said that she should be released, while the other 2 said she should remain in jail. The next time she'll be up for parole is in 2032, when she'll be 84 years old, and it's thought that she'll probably spend the rest of her life behind bars. While no party involved in this divorce behaved well, it just didn't justify Betty's actions. She was only convicted of second-degree murder, likely because of the sympathy members of the jury had for her, but there was really enough evidence to prove first-degree murder in my opinion. She'd been threatening them for years. She told multiple people and was caught on tape saying she wanted to kill them. She even said as much to her children. No matter what Dan and Linda might have done to Betty, and I believe they were at the very least inconsiderate and selfish, Betty likely hurt herself much more. That's it for this video. Once again, I'll put the link to the trial videos down in the description below. Like, subscribe, all that jazz, and I will see you in the next video.